Okay, I just wanted to say hello to everyone and welcome for making it. I know that all of these sessions always take a little bit of time out of your day, and I appreciate your attendance. And if you're listening in on the recording, I appreciate that as well. I kind of wanted to kind of go through a little bit about the agenda to kind of discuss what we're going to be going through. We're going to be starting with a model that I've developed called the Understand, Build, Launch, which is related to how successful organizations implement change and how it relates to project management. I will also be discussing another model, which is the cultural pyramid, which will discuss culture and how the different factors relate to it and how culture kind of coincides and relates with project management. Then I'm going to go back and review the model. I am going to be interested if anyone has any feedback, comments, or questions throughout the presentation, but I kind of put that section in there so that way if you had any questions about the model that you kind of churned through your head, you can ask at that time. And then I'm going to discuss the flower of change, which is another concept regarding change to help people apply change in project management settings. And then we're going to go through measuring change, which is another model in order to kind of determine how successful change has been in an organization. Many times people don't necessarily understand what change has happened, because if you've been part of the change and it's incrementally been happening over a period of time, you don't realize the actual distance of the change that has occurred. And then after that, I'm going to go through a simulation that I've done in other scenarios and other presentations where I've actually used the model and applied it to groups, as large as a few hundred project managers in order to kind of give them a feeling of how the model works and see how things change and how really culture is an important aspect of project management regardless of the actual project or the content. And then I'm going to go through a little bit about the review and talk about what I've seen happen, how it's happened, and some of the feedback that I've gotten during those presentations. And then I'm going to end with a question and answer session, which is going to kind of go through, again, if there's any other burning questions about any of the material that I presented. So I will now move on, but that is what we're going to be going through. Okay. Kind of before we jump into the model, I kind of wanted to talk about exactly what culture is defined as and kind of give you also my personal definition when it comes to culture, and then discuss a little bit about some of the myths that people have about culture, because I feel that it's important to understand why is this relevant to project management. To start, the normal or kind of the organizational management standard definition of culture is a pattern of shared basic assumptions that a group learned as it solved its problem of external adaptation in internal integration that has worked well enough to be considered valid and therefore to be taught to new members as the correct way to perceive, think, and feel in relation to those problems. So in that standard definition, one of the elements that often people don't necessarily associate with change, but is important to change, is that element of worked well enough to be considered valid. And I feel that that kind of relates back to training, meaning if it's part of the training and it worked and it's valid, it's relevant and it works. And so just keep that in mind, that when you're dealing with culture and change, that training is essential. And training doesn't necessarily mean sitting in a conference room looking at a PowerPoint slide presentation, but it does mean that you're getting kind of feedback on your actions, you're taking certain actions, they appear to be relevant and correct, and then you continue with those actions moving forward. Now, my definition is slightly different than that. I like to look at culture as a fabric, and I consider it as a fabric of experiences that allow one to consider how each thread helps make up the organizational culture as a whole. Each simple thread is woven together in a manner that allows the fabric to become more than the individual threads alone. A fabric is a discrete item that people understand to be the combination of different threads. However, each thread is important to the overall fabric. When too many threads are damaged, the fabric begins to unravel. When enough unraveling occurs, the fabric will cease to exist and return to being threads. if one were to view each thread as a simple binary thought, one could see how these binary thoughts can be brought together to create a culture. Culture exists as simple concepts brought together and held by the group. So I am taking a little bit different view where I'm saying, well, all of these elements are interrelated and connected in some way, and that they are creating a fabric, and that each of the threads represent kind of a common value or a binary thought where people agree or disagree with something, and those are woven together to create a culture. And so this becomes important in project management because, again, in a project, you're trying to achieve a certain goal with a certain team in a certain time. And if you're able to get a culture that supports all those elements, then you're going to be far more successful. And the better that you're able to create that culture and to create those binary agreements within the team, the more that people are going to move towards the goal, move towards the commonalities that they have. And it's interesting to see, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, that oftentimes the commonalities are kind of what brings us together. And one has to also understand that just because things or people don't have the exact 100% the same things in common, there needs to be a level of trust and respect where people are willing to accept perhaps different views as long as they are supportive of the common goals. So to that end, I kind of want to talk now, jumping into a little bit about the model because I feel that it's important. At the high level, the 3 steps are really understand, build, launch. And once again, and this is how you're taking culture and implementing it into a project management situation. So the first element is always going to be understanding, meaning when the organization starts or if you're taking over a project that is having trouble, the first step is always to take a step back and really understand what the culture is, what the training has been, what the organization believes or does not believe. And some of those can be ground down into something very basic. And a common thread that you find, for example, when you're coming into a troubled project is that there will be typically an understanding by all members that the project isn't going to be successful. And for whatever reason they've come to that conclusion, as a project manager moving into that, you need to understand where they're coming from and why the reasons perhaps this is, the conclusion they've come to. Now, it doesn't always mean they're right. It doesn't always mean that it's true. But many times, trouble projects, the first thing that needs to be done is to understand what they believe, and in many cases to dispel that belief, because if everyone believes the project's not going to be successful, it's not going to become successful because no one's going to try hard enough. People are going to try to escape. People are going to try to move on, and it's just not a great culture to be part of. And part of that kind of training or retraining is going to get people to understand, well, hey, there is hope, there is possibilities, we're adding resources, we're doing this, and that's essentially retraining people. And that's part of that understanding process where you really need to understand the organization. And doing that is going to require observing, asking questions, and building that foundation for change. And many times that foundation for change is just the mere fact that a new project manager is entering into the picture. Many times with the entrance of a new person, there'll be a new culture, there'll be new opportunities. And as a new project manager, one needs to take advantage of that and utilize that opportunity, because if the person doesn't take charge and doesn't start making changes that are viewed as positive, it could mean that people are thinking, oh, well, the status quo will remain and the project is still not going to be successful. The same is very true of a new project, pulling together a new team that's never worked together without any knowledge or understanding. People may assume that, well, this isn't going to work, people aren't getting along, but that's just kind of part of the process that happens with any new team. The next piece is to build, and part of that is to build the foundation for change. And many times that's going to take some kind of structure or some kind of framework that's going to be required, where the project manager is going to have to